Launched into the sky in January of 1986, the world thought it was watching another proud milestone in America's space program. What most people didn't know was that this mission, like many before it, was built on years of ignored warnings, risky design choices, and political desperation. Challenger didn't just fail because of a rubber seal. It failed because it was the product of a system that made safety optional. But why did NASA push forward with such a fragile design? What was really driving America's space program in the first place? And why did the dream of reusable spaceflight begin with so many red flags? The Space Shuttle. After the final Apollo mission returned to Earth in 1972, NASA found itself in a strange position. It had achieved the unthinkable, putting men on the moon, and yet, instead of celebrating endless funding, it was now being told to scale back. Congress was cutting budgets, and public attention was shifting. The moon landings had been spectacular, but now, people asked, what's next? NASA had to answer that question fast, or risk becoming obsolete. Their solution was bold: build a space shuttle that could be launched over and over again. Not just once every few years, like Apollo, but frequently, up to 24 times per year. It would look and act more like an aircraft than a one-way rocket. It would carry astronauts, satellites, even military payloads into orbit and bring them back safely. The idea was that this would make space travel cheaper, more routine, and more appealing to the government and the public alike. NASA called it the Space Transportation System, but everyone else just called it the Space Shuttle. They pitched it as a workhorse for the future, a reusable space truck that could do it all. Behind closed doors, however, there were serious problems. The ambitious design ran up against a harsh reality: money. Congress wouldn't approve the funding NASA needed to make the safest version of this vehicle. So compromises began. One of the most critical design choices involved the shuttle's two solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. These were enormous cylindrical rockets attached to either side of the shuttle's external fuel tank. They provided the majority of thrust at liftoff. But here's the problem: the safest option, liquid-fueled boosters, was rejected. Why? Because they were more expensive, more complex, and required more development time. Instead, NASA selected solid boosters made by Morton Thiokol, a private contractor with strong political ties. Solid boosters are cheaper to make and simpler to store, but they're also far more dangerous. Once ignited, they cannot be shut off. They burn until the fuel is gone. If something goes wrong in flight, there's no way to abort. From the moment those boosters are lit, the crew is committed. The SRBs were also designed in segments, a decision driven by manufacturing and transport concerns. Instead of building a single, seamless rocket, Morton Thiokol made the boosters in pieces and bolted them together with joints. These joints were sealed using O-rings, rubber gaskets that were supposed to expand and prevent hot gases from leaking out. But that design came with a deadly weakness. If the O-rings didn't seal properly, especially in cold weather, superheated gases could escape and burn through the booster casing. Engineers pointed out this vulnerability early in testing. There were warning signs as early as 1981. But because no shuttle had been lost yet, NASA leadership viewed the risks as tolerable. They believed that past success was proof of future safety. It's a belief that would cost lives. During the Cold War, NASA's shuttle program doubled as a covert military asset. The Department of Defense planned to use it for launching spy satellites and classified payloads, including secret missions from a polar orbit site in California. NASA was balancing public science, military expectations, and congressional scrutiny, all at once. To secure funding, it promised up to 24 launches per year, despite each shuttle requiring exhaustive inspections and repairs after every flight. But instead of slowing down, NASA sped up. Challenger was never designed for failure, only for show. Its sleek frame concealed fragile systems and dangerous shortcuts. And as launch after launch reinforced a false sense of safety, the agency marched forward, unaware, or unwilling to admit, that disaster was already built into the machine. New bombshells about the Challenger disaster that will blow your mind. In the year 2022, nearly 4 decades after Challenger broke apart in the sky, something chilling surfaced beneath the waves. A dive team filming a World War II documentary off the coast of Florida stumbled upon an object that didn't match anything from that era. What they had discovered, completely by accident, was a 20-foot-long section of the Challenger space shuttle, preserved beneath layers of sand and seawater. It was one of the largest and most intact pieces of the wreckage ever recovered, and no one had been looking for it. The footage showed unmistakable thermal tiles still clinging to the fuselage, a haunting reminder of a tragedy most assumed had long been closed. But what else is still down there? And why did NASA keep some wreckage locations secret for so long? The discovery forced NASA to issue a rare public confirmation, acknowledging the find and stating that the debris would be preserved out of respect for the families and the legacy of the crew. But behind the official statements, the incident reignited a question that's been lingering since 1986. How much do we still not know about what really happened to Challenger, and why it happened at all? Just 2 years later, in 2024, attention returned to Krista McAuliffe, the schoolteacher who had captured the hearts of millions. A life-sized bronze statue was unveiled in her home state of New Hampshire, showing her mid-gesture, engaging, smiling, frozen in the hopeful energy she carried into that doomed launch. The statue wasn't just a tribute. It was a signal that her legacy, and the legacy of all 7 astronauts, still matters. Across classrooms and campuses, her story is being taught not as a feel-good moment about civilian spaceflight, but as a sobering lesson in risk, silence, and institutional failure. And then, in early 2025, another name returned to the spotlight. William R. Lucas, former director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, and a central figure during the Challenger era. Lucas passed away at the age of 102. For years, his name had been associated with the booster program, the very one responsible for the failed O-rings. In the aftermath of the disaster, the Rogers Commission had pointed to the culture at Marshall under Lucas's leadership as deeply problematic. Engineers were discouraged from raising concerns, dissent was quietly pushed aside, and bad news was often filtered out before reaching top decision-makers. His death didn't just prompt obituaries, it reignited debate. Could Lucas have prevented the disaster? Should more accountability have been demanded from those in charge? Some insiders have even argued that his management style set the tone for a system where safety was too easily overruled by schedule and optics. In the final years of his life, Lucas gave few interviews and never publicly expressed regret over the decisions made in the lead-up to the launch. Meanwhile, the most brutal detail of the entire Challenger story continues to shock people when they hear it for the first time. Most assume the astronauts died instantly, as the fireball engulfed the sky. But that isn't what happened. In fact, at least some of the crew were alive, possibly fully conscious, during the shuttle's 2-minute freefall toward the Atlantic Ocean. The evidence? 3 of the 7 astronauts' personal egress air packs, or PEAPs, were manually activated after the shuttle disintegrated. These were small emergency devices designed to provide breathable air, not pressurized, not life-saving, but a temporary aid in case of cabin smoke or depressurization. Even more disturbing, cockpit switches had been moved from their original launch positions, indicating someone was still trying to regain control, or at least stabilize the descent. The cabin remained largely intact until it struck the ocean at more than 200 miles per hour, an impact that was completely unsurvivable. NASA initially withheld these details, releasing them only after intense media and congressional pressure. And to this day, the agency has avoided making definitive statements about exactly how long the crew may have remained aware of their situation. It's a deeply uncomfortable truth that doesn't appear in most school textbooks or official memorials. But it underscores how avoidable the disaster truly was. If the O-rings had held, if the launch had been delayed, if engineers had been heard, those final moments in the crew cabin never had to happen. That discomfort is what journalist Adam Higginbotham tapped into with his 2024 investigative book, Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. The book went beyond the technical failure, focusing instead on the psychology and bureaucracy that allowed the failure to happen. Higginbotham lays out in disturbing detail how NASA's culture, in the 1980s, had shifted from Apollo-era caution to shuttle-era overconfidence. Risk was redefined as acceptable, warning signs were rebranded as anomalies, and engineers were subtly taught that speaking up might cost them their careers. He describes the launch not as a tragic fluke, but as the predictable outcome of a system that had stopped listening. Through interviews, archived memos, and new disclosures, the book reveals how close Challenger came to disaster on multiple earlier missions, and how those near misses made NASA more, not less, likely to push forward without fixing the core issues. Perhaps one of the most controversial revelations Higginbotham revisits is the persistent rumor of political pressure surrounding Challenger's launch. At the time, President Ronald Reagan was preparing to deliver his State of the Union address, and having a teacher broadcast from space would have been a powerful visual to support his administration's message of American exceptionalism. No written order has ever been found linking the White House to the decision to launch. However, several NASA managers reportedly believed that another delay would reflect badly on the president, and thus chose to push forward despite the cold weather and engineers' objections. So much of what made Challenger vulnerable wasn't the technology. It was the culture. A culture that prized deadlines over details. That labeled dissent as disloyalty. That relied on public trust more than engineering discipline. And that looked at a record of close calls and decided, somehow, that things were fine. Designing for disaster, the flawed rocket NASA kept flying. The solid rocket boosters that helped launch the Challenger into the sky were never supposed to be built that way. But they were segmented, bolted together, and sealed with rubber gaskets known as O-rings. That decision, made for manufacturing convenience and political approval, created one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities in modern aerospace history. The boosters were made in sections so they could be transported by rail from the contractor's plant in Utah. Each segment was joined to the next with a field joint, sealed by 2 rubber O-rings. These rings were meant to expand when exposed to the heat of ignition, sealing the joint and preventing the escape of burning gases. But even in early test flights, things didn't go as planned. As early as 1981, engineers noticed black soot and burn marks near the O-rings, evidence that the seals weren't always working. In multiple missions between 1981 and 1985, post-flight analysis revealed erosion, charring, and even partial failure of the primary O-ring. In some cases, only the secondary O-ring, the backup, had kept hot gases from escaping. It was like discovering a hairline crack in a dam but deciding not to fix it because the water hadn't broken through. Yet, the normalization of deviance. What kind of system looks at multiple seal failures and chooses to keep flying anyway? The answer lies in a dangerous shift in mindset, what engineers and sociologists would later call the normalization of deviance. The idea is simple: if something goes wrong repeatedly but doesn't lead to immediate disaster, people start treating it as normal. The shuttle's O-rings were eroding. That was a fact. But because the flights kept landing safely, managers began assuming the damage was acceptable. The erosion was reframed as a known issue, not a red flag. And that shift, from anomaly to expectation, is where the real danger began. One of the engineers most disturbed by this pattern was Roger Boisjoli, a senior specialist at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters. He began raising serious alarms internally as early as 1984, following several missions where O-ring damage was more severe than anything previously seen. After a flight in August of that year, engineers found soot between the 2 O-rings in one of the joints. That meant the primary seal had failed entirely. Only the secondary had saved the crew. Boisjoli didn't see this as a minor hiccup. He saw it as a clear sign that the next flight could be fatal.